How can an all-loving God send people to hell? This is a question that comes up often from both believers and non-believers alike. Just doesn't seem to make sense. God is all love. He is love. How can he send people to a place of eternal suffering? We need to dive into this and figure this out. And what about all the people that have never even heard about Jesus or his church? Are they by default just sent to eternal suffering? Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a much better understanding of the Christian belief surrounding hell and hopefully how to avoid it. I want to start with a clip from Rationality Rules, who sets up the how could a loving God send people to hell objection, followed up by a clip from Bishop Barron, who I think perfectly answers, responds to that first clip, and sheds light on this idea of how a loving God could send people to hell. And then hang around until the end. I'm going to share a passage from a very famous author who really wraps all of this up quite brilliantly for us. And let's get into it.
So Sharon was saying, and a lot of Christians will say, that there is this hope, this salvation to, live for eternity and whatnot. Is that true of atheists? Did Jesus preach that? Did he not say that you will only get to heaven if you believe in me? Does not Islam teach that the infidel is going to hell? There's no reward for people like this. And yet, what would a good God do? If God was all powerful and he was all loving, would he really eternally send someone away from him because they can't convince themselves that Muhammad split the moon? Because they can't convince themselves that Jesus resurrected? This isn't congruent. You're not describing a loving God here. You're describing anything but.
In the course of my work in evangelization, I often run across this objection. How could an all-good God possibly send people to hell? How could a God who's described as infinitely good create, sustain, and send people to a place of infinite, horrible torment? And you find the objection from both believers and non-believers. In fact, a lot of my friends on YouTube have directed my attention to a video done by George Carlin, the comedian, many years ago. Carlin, I suppose, was an ex-Catholic, and he was lampooning the whole idea of hell. And he said, well, for some sin, usually of a sexual nature, God will send you to this place of infinite, horrible, tremendous torment. But then he changes and he says, but of course, this God loves you. And of course, the people all, burst into hysterical laughter. They can't get enough of it. Now, you have to confess, somewhere in your soul, you think, well, maybe Carlin's got a point. Is there something just inconsistent about this belief in the eternity of hell? Well, I would suggest that we should be very careful about dismissing this doctrine, which has been enunciated by all the great theologians of our tradition, and in fact, goes back to Jesus himself. On the lips of Jesus himself, we find this language of Gehenna and of the everlasting fire, and so on. I would say this: the doctrine of hell is a corollary, a kind of a necessary consequence of two other doctrines, and I doubt anybody wants to deny these other two, namely that God is love and that we human beings are free. I think you can't hold those two without also holding the possibility of hell. Now here's why. Look first at the claim that God is love. We hold not that God has love, or that love is one of God's attributes, or love is something that God does from time to time. Love is what God is. The whole nature, essence, substance, life of God is love. To will the good of the other as other, that's who God is. Therefore, God doesn't go in and out of love, doesn't love some, hate others. He doesn't go into emotional snits and change his mind. God simply is love. In Jesus' language, he's like the sun that shines on the good and the bad alike. There's the idea of the primacy of grace and of God's love, which is all through our tradition. There's the first great teaching. Now here's the second one, that human beings are free. Look, God made planets and plants and animals and insects to glorify him simply by being themselves. That's how they reflect the divine goodness. But human beings he made with intelligence and will. That means he wants us to respond to his love, who he is, with our own love. He gave us that privilege of our freedom. Now, the minute you say freedom, you have to say the possibility of the abuse of freedom. That's the nature of freedom, is I can decide yes or no. I can say yes to the love that God is and thereby find joy and peace and my own deepest purpose, or I can say no to it. I can resist it. What does that cause, that resistance? It causes suffering at the level of the soul, the deepest level. It's like fire. It's like torment. It's like everlasting flames. Why am I using that language? Because it's biblical language to suggest this great spiritual suffering. What is hell? Hell would be that final and definitive no to God's love uttered from the depth of one's soul. That's hell. Eternal suffering, yeah, because it's this eternal no to the love that God is. Now, I think in light of this clarification, we can see how all the language of God sending people to hell, God condemning people to hell because of their mistakes and so on, is problematic. God doesn't so much send people there. People send themselves into this state by their refusal of the divine love. That's why C.S. Lewis said, I think wonderfully, the door to hell is always locked from the inside. It's not as though God is maliciously locking it from the outside, locking people in. Rather, it's people themselves who, by their refusal, lock themselves away from the divine love. That's what hell would be. Lewis also said this, and I think it's really interesting. He said, the love of God lights up the fires of hell. They say, what does that mean? How counterintuitive. But see, love is what God is. That's all God knows how to do. The love of God is always shining on us. But if you turn away from it, it becomes a kind of torture to you because you're meant to respond to it. The very love in which the saint basks in joy is what the sinner suffers in. Think of it this way. Imagine a great party is going on. This exuberant, joyful, riotously fun party is going on. One person is there who is completely surrendered to it. They've given themselves over to the exuberance of the party. They're having the time of their life. And now imagine someone at the same party. They've come into the same party, but they are turned in on themselves in a kind of reproachful self-regard, sitting sullenly in the corner. For that person, the very exuberance of the party is a torture. The very exuberance of the party is a source of suffering. We shouldn't talk about God capriciously sending people to hell. We should think of hell this way. If anyone's in it, and by the way, the church is not obliging anyone to believe that a human being is in hell. We just don't know. But if there is anyone in it, it's someone who is absolutely insisted on not attending the party.
I think Bishop Barron really hit the nail on the head there. I just want to add this little bit from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is from page 847. This is concerning people who have never heard of Jesus or his church. Those who, through no fault of their own, do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, but who nevertheless seek God with a sincere heart and moved by grace try in their actions to do his will as they know it through the dictates of their conscience, those too may achieve eternal salvation. So they aren't just sent to hell by default. And finally, I want to wrap this up with a short passage from a very famous author. People often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargain in which God says, if you keep a lot of rules, I'll reward you, and if you don't, I'll do the other thing. I do not think that is the best way of looking at it. I would much rather say that every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before, and taking your life as a whole with all of your innumerable choices all your life long. You are slowly turning this central thing either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature, either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself. To be the one kind of creature is heaven. That is, it is joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, impotence, and eternal loneliness. Each of us at each moment is progressing to one state or the other. That's from Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis. See you in the next one. God bless.